All right, hello and welcome to Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jenny Liu and I am an associate professor in the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning. Together with Dr. Monsieur, I host the Friday seminar and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. So our Friday transportation seminar has been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, Tuolumne, and other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and their legacies. So due to the pandemic, today's seminar is hosted fully online. And we have also a link that will be posted in the chat for donations and information about the programming from the PSU Native American and Student Community Center. So today, we're very pleased to have Shoshana Cohen and Emma Sagor present on a new approach to transportation pricing, lessons from the POEM project. Shoshana can work with the Portland.gov Transportation, where she manages the intergovernmental affairs team in the Office of the Director. She helps to advance PBOT's state, federal, and regional priorities and works on special initiatives related to the two top bureau goals. Shoshana has overseen PBOT's congestion pricing efforts for 4 years and served as the co-project manager for the pricing options for Equitable Mobility Task Force for the past 2 years. She has a master's in urban planning and policy and over 20 years of experience ranging from policy research to nonprofit management. Emma Sagor leads the strategic performance team for the Portland Bureau of Transportation, where she focuses on tracking and analyzing data is strategic priorities of equity, safety, climate mobility, and asset management. Prior to this, she served for 2 years as the City of Portland's Climate Advisor through the Bloomberg Philanthropies American Cities Climate Challenge. And as part of her climate challenge responsibilities, she co-managed the pricing options for Equitable Mobility project and supported other critical climate efforts, including the Rose Lane project. She has a master's degree in region urban planning studies from the London School of Economics and 10 years of experience working in the academic, private, and commercial sectors. So as you know, this is our final transportation seminar for the fall term. Thank you for attending. Reminder to students that your final reflections are due next week. The dates are all on D2L. Thank you for attending, and future seminar information will be coming relatively soon. We wanted to also share some information about an opportunity to study sustainable transportation abroad in Denmark and Sweden next summer through PSU's Study Abroad program. Applications are due at the end of January. So more information will be at the link that will be posted in the chat as well. So moving on to today's seminar, just an overview that you can expect our speakers to present for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A. And please enter in your questions in the Q&A feature on your panel, and me and Dr. Monsieur will be moderating and asking those at the end of the presentation. And in the case that we have time, our speakers will also get your unanswered questions via email. And if you do want to enable closed captioning, those are available on the closed captioning button that you can click. And a reminder that this webinar is recorded and it will be available later today along with the presentation slides. And you have 1 hour of professional development hours if that is what you're working for. All right, with that, I will hand it over to Shoshana and Emma for today's exciting presentation.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's great to be with you all. I will do a little screen share shuffle here to get our slides up. And Chris, thanks for the thumbs up. Looks like that's working well. All right. Well, good, I guess, almost afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Sagor. I'm the Strategic Performance Manager at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And along with my colleague, Shoshana Cohen, we are the co-project managers of the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility project. We know that's a mouthful, so we shorten it to the cute name of POEM. So you'll hear us say POEM a lot in this presentation. And we're really excited to share with you some of the lessons learned from the project over the last couple of years. Today, our outline, we're really going to start by talking about what is pricing. What is, sometimes called congestion pricing. It's defined in a lot of different ways. So we want to tell you how we at the city define it. And then we wanted to talk about why the interest in pricing now? Why in our region are we taking a closer look? Then we'll talk a little bit about this community task force that we set up to look deeper at pricing that we met with for about a year and a half. And we'll talk about the process they went through to analyze different types of pricing. And then we'll end sharing with some of the recommendations that came out of that task force process and sort of what our next steps and those big lessons learned are. So to start off, we want to set the scene by defining what that big P word means, what pricing means in the Portland context. So to us, pricing really means charges for driving or using roadway space. And these charges are really intended to help people consider the value of that space or the costs and impacts of using that space on our roads for driving. Sometimes you hear it called price signals because it's sending a signal to the driver. Now, the general theory behind using price signals can really be seen widely across our economy. You think of concert tickets or sporting event tickets that get more expensive if it's a big event and there's high demand, or that maybe go down as you get closer and they need to fill seats. Or, you think about last week, the Black Friday sales, things that can really encourage behavior by sending a price signal, either by having the price be lower or be higher. And from a behavioral psychology lens, people's behavior can be greatly influenced by these signals. They really help them weigh up the timeliness of a decision or that personal cost or benefit to them. And they can also help meet or demand for things when that supply is limited. So applying price signals in a transportation context is a bit newer, although we've had prices in our transportation system for decades. Think of parking meters that have been around for almost 100 years. But as we'll discuss in a bit, there's a lot of examples from the last few decades of really using pricing even more intentionally to advance policy goals. And just like in other sectors across the economy, transportation pricing can be a really flexible tool and designed to vary based on the different price signals you want to send and the various policy outcomes you want to achieve. It could vary based on the time of day. It could vary based on the congestion levels on our roads, the location and where you want to see demand or manage demand, the number of people in a car, the fuel efficiency of a car, really, you name it. It's a very flexible tool that can be adapted based on the policy outcomes you want to achieve. So why are we in Portland suddenly very interested in pricing? And really, it isn't that sudden. As Shoshana's bio said, she's been working on this for the city for almost 5 years. So why that regional interest in looking at the role of pricing? Well, to put it bluntly, it's because of some very significant and growing challenges that are facing our auto-oriented transportation status quo. One of those costs is really around our climate crisis and rising carbon emissions. In our region, the transportation sector contributes the biggest portion of our carbon emissions pie. About 43% of Portland regional emissions come from transportation. And we really are not bending that curve in any of the way we need to meet our climate goals and stave off the worst of the climate crisis. Another significant cost we experience is around safety. We continue to see tragically and unacceptably high rates of fatalities and serious injuries on our transportation system. And we know there's a correlation between more miles driven, or sometimes called VMT, vehicle miles driven, and safety crashes and injuries. And another cost, state the obvious, is congestion. Driving trips, as those go up and our roads get more and more congested, that means we experience costs in terms of lost time, as well as economic costs of, being more expensive and more slow to move goods around our city. And the pandemic has been kind of an interesting experiment looking at the congestion trends. We did see a sharp drop in congestion right after the pandemic started and folks were not going out. But really interestingly, we saw congestion recover really quickly. And right now our congestion and our vehicle miles traveled levels on our roads are back to very close to pre-pandemic levels. So these costs that I mentioned here, they're all very real economically and socially, even if we're not paying for them directly every time we get into our car. And while those costs and challenges impact all of us, we also know that transportation status quo has inequitable impacts and costs, that vulnerable communities are often hardest hit by all those things I mentioned on that last screen. And especially when we leave with the climate crisis, they're hurt first and foremost by the impacts of climate change. And really, when you look across many indicators of things we care about in our system, you see those inequities bear out across the bullets on this screen. Looking at safety, the death rate from traffic crashes among Black Multnomah County residents is significantly higher than the rate among white residents. When we look at access to mobility options, almost 30% of Black households in Portland do not have access to a vehicle, compared with only 12% of white households. That's based on 2019 data. When we look at infrastructure condition, that is not equitably distributed across our city. Health disparities exist, both in terms of the air quality emissions that we can measure in different parts of our city that are closer to highway facilities and other things, as well as then the outcomes that leads to, so asthma rates and cardiovascular illness rates. And then when we also think about the interplay of transportation, housing, and displacement or gentrification, we see inequities in access to places and to services and jobs and economic opportunity bearing out across our city. So before moving on, I want to be clear that while all of this is true and these are really real costs, we also totally understand that people drive for so many reasons. And we really have an auto-centric, auto-oriented transportation system that's built to make auto travel the most efficient option in many cases. Whether it's getting to jobs that are not easy to get to by other modes, or taking kids to daycare when you're tight on time, or driving more because you've been displaced away from multimodal options. We absolutely understand that there's so many reasons every day people need to drive. So as we think about changing the system to try to capture more of these true costs and really bend the curve in a lot of these areas, we also have to continue to understand those reasons why people drive and strive to make it easier and easier for them to make other choices. So for all those reasons, we know we need to kind of crack this nut and look at how we can manage demand and driving on our roads. And at PBOT and the city of Portland, we've been trying a lot of things and using a lot of tools to do that. We do things like build infrastructure that makes other modes faster. Think of the bus lanes and the Rose Lane project and those kinds of things, the ways we can use our space on our streets to support our goals. We provide direct modal services through things like Bike Town or permitting other services like scooter share and those kinds of things. Thinking of the other side of that price coin, we also understand that financial support and incentives is another piece of this equation, and our programs like the Transportation Wallet give people more access to different options to get around. And finally, you've got to kind of get the word out, right? There's outreach and there's education, there's helping people understand how they can use other options safely. All of these are critically important to achieving our goals. But the fact remains those trends in climate, in safety, in congestion, and so on are not going the direction we need them to. So we need new tools. We simply need more in our toolbox in order to meet the challenges of today. And that's why we're having a conversation about pricing. Back in 2017, City Council directed PBOT to do research on pricing and really find what lessons they could learn from other cities that have tapped into this tool in their toolbox. And the research really indicated that pricing is a proven and effective tool for managing congestion and climate emissions. A couple examples: in London, they have a central city cordon congestion pricing style. And when that was put in place in 2003, they saw a 30% reduction in motor vehicle trips and in delays, and a 17% reduction in carbon emissions. In Stockholm, it was a very similar story. Congestion pricing led to 22% reduction in trips, almost a third of a reduction in delays, and a 14% reduction in carbon emissions. Closer to home, we don't have a lot of examples of those big style congestion pricing, but our neighbors to the north have been using pricing on facilities in ways with dynamic tolling. The picture in the top right is of the SR 520 bridge that uses dynamic tolls to manage demand very successfully. And then parking pricing is another way where you can kind of use price signals more dynamically, more intentionally to achieve outcomes. The one on the bottom left is from DC, but Washington, DC, Seattle, San Francisco. These are lots of examples of cities that have done a lot on the parking side. And I will say, while these are cities where it's been shown to work, I think to state the obvious, it's politically difficult to implement pricing. Convincing people to pay more for something than they do today is tricky, and it's a uphill battle. But in a lot of these places where they maybe face that political challenge, once implemented and once the benefits have been seen, they've seen a real shift in political opinion around pricing. And in Stockholm, I think it went from being a pilot to very quickly embraced and supported by most folks. And in addition to pricing being a proven tool for managing congestion and climate emissions, it also is a tool that can generate funding, and that can be reinvested into the transportation system. Now in Portland, our discussion of pricing has really been centered around how pricing can be a tool for policy change, not about raising revenue or solving a funding problem. But the broader transportation funding context is really important to mention. Transportation funding has really not been keeping up with inflation. And we're in a situation where our funding sources are dependent on fossil fuels, right? Or on gas taxes or on things like parking revenue. And that can be in contrast with our goals of wanting to, make cars more efficient, reduce emissions and reduce overall trips. So we're in this kind of conundrum where we're getting less revenue in as cars become more fuel efficient, but also the costs that are on our system are on the rise. And that's partly because there's just more demand on our system. Some of the pictures you see here today, are things that 5 years ago we never would have thought would exist. The thousands or millions of TNC trips, transportation network company trips on our roads, or the on-demand urban delivery that's just really boomed, especially during the pandemic. These are things that put costs on our systems. So now we have more to manage, but also less revenue to do so. All right, so we know pricing can be a tool for congestion management and climate management. We know that it has also some potential to, raise revenue for reinvestment in the system. But in 2019, we were left kind of with this question. All that said, can pricing be done in a way that truly makes a system more equitable rather than adding to existing inequities and burdens? Even if it, does the other things, it accomplishes making our system, reducing delays, reducing emissions. If it makes our system less equitable, that's not achieving the goals we have as the city of Portland. And so we really realized that was the next question we had to ask. And so like a lot of things in Portland, we did it a little differently than I think a lot of cities do. A lot of cities got to that step of, wow, this is showing real promise in other cities. We're gonna do a big study in our context and a technical look at what emissions could do and what could happen to trips. And we said, we're not gonna do that quite yet. We're gonna start with a community conversation around this equity question. And we're gonna ask that first before we complete a technical study so that we really know what we need to look at and what those kind of policy values are that matter most to the city of Portland. And in 2019, City Council kind of gave us the direction to do just that, to start with that community conversation and specifically to convene a community task force. And they said, we want you to go and look at pricing again and answer that question of, can it be done equitably? And so I'm about to hand it over to Shoshana. She's going to tell you all about what we did with that task force. But this was the question back in 2019 we set out to answer. Could we use new pricing strategies in Portland to improve mobility, to address the climate crisis, and to move towards a more equitable system? And now I will hand it to Shoshana to take it forward.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Again, Shoshana Cohen, the Intergovernmental Affairs Manager for the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So happy to be with you all this afternoon. So as Emma said, I'll talk a little bit more about the task force, the process we went through with them, and then the recommendations that they came up with at the end of the process. This is a picture of the 19 folks who sat with us on this Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility Task Force. They started in January 2020 and they wrapped up in July 2021. we began the process. They were able to have 3 meetings in person, which was nice. We were able to get to know each other a little bit before we had to switch to the online format. And these task force members really represented a very diverse set of perspectives. They, came to the table, some of them very excited to have a conversation about pricing and sort of ready to say, sure, it can advance climate inequity, and some of them much more skeptical. A lot of folks, when they hear that question, can pricing be equitable? The first answer, I think, is no, you can't charge more and make it more equitable. And so we really had people who came in with a bunch of different perspectives and background and interests. They did all, as we were recruiting, we were interested in different perspectives. We did also say we want to have a conversation centered around this question of really, can pricing not only be good for climate and mobility, but can it be good for equity? So everyone sort of knew that was the conversation, that was the frame. And there was a lot of interest when we first did the recruitment. I believe we had 130 people apply, and we were looking for about 20. So there's a lot of people interested in this conversation, and we're just super appreciative that these people stayed with us. They volunteered their time throughout the last year and a half to sort of have these really complicated conversations around policy and community and equity topics. So what were they doing for that 18 months? We didn't start right in sort of, can pricing be equitable? Instead, we started and we shared information about really the history of the transportation system, and in some ways the history of city planning in the Portland area. And one of the things that we talked a lot about that Emma mentioned already is the existing inequities in the system, and these, all sorts of existing problems in the system. And so we talked about the history of how all of that came to be, why the decisions were made, how we have the transportation system that we have, and how many of the decisions that sort of got us here were intentional and really set up this design that leads to existing inequities, it leads to climate problems, it leads to safety problems. So we did some background with how we got to where we are. We then discussed and created what is called an equitable mobility framework to help us analyze and to help them analyze pricing strategies and consider if they really could help to make the system more equitable. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the next slide. Then after sort of doing that background work, they dived in on 5 different types of pricing. Again, we'll go over what they were. Throughout this process, it was some Portland City staff that were talking to them and hearing from them, as well as we had a variety of experts, people who have done this work, not only in other places in the United States, but in London, in Stockholm. And they were really able to share a lot of experience about what has worked, what hasn't, what are pitfalls, what are things that we should be thinking about here. And then, as Emma said, we really did sort of ground our process in a community conversation and not just set off and start to have a big technical process. That said, we did have some technical information that we shared with the task force along the way. One of the things that was happening concurrently is that the Metro regional government has been doing what they've called a regional congestion pricing study. I think there's a fancier word, but it is more of a technical analysis that has looked at many of the same pricing strategies that we were discussing, and they sort of modeled what would happen if we were to do them in the Portland area. So we were able to share that technical information as well as some other technical information with the task force and help them understand what could these strategies potentially do. And then at the end of sort of all of that, towards the end of the 18 months, they discussed and then voted on some recommendations, which we'll be sharing with you in a few minutes. So the equitable mobility framework, as I mentioned, before the group was able to dive in and really discuss any pricing topics, they really first had to define equitable mobility and what does equitable mobility mean to them. It's in the project name, and we really need to know what we're talking about. If they could say yes or no in moving the bar towards achieving it. So these are some pictures from the 3rd meeting. This was the last meeting before we had to move to online, when the world looked different for all of us. And then we sort of called this an equitable mobility workshop. And the purpose here was, again, really to ask, what would a system that worked better, that was more equitable, look like? And what are the key indicators or outcomes? How will we know if we have a system that is more equitable? And so the task force didn't start from scratch in coming up with this. We actually started out with a similar framework that came out of the Green Lining Institute, a leading climate mobility organization out of California. And so we took their sort of starting ideas around what are the indicators of a more equitable system. And then we had our task force workshop it. And they came up with sort of 5 general categories of outcomes of things that we care about, that the transportation system influences in some way and that we care about. And it's in the category of moving people and goods, sustainability and health, safety, economic opportunity. And then the last one is actually really more around process, having an equitable transportation planning process. And even within all of those sort of higher level outcome areas, there are more specific indicators. Things like in moving people and goods, we want the system to be affordable, to be reliable, to be high quality. And within sustainability and health, what the indicators are, the climate impact and the health impact and things like that. So there's this whole sort of suite of outcomes and indicators that we can look to and evaluate a particular policy and say, if we institute this particular policy, whether it's a pricing policy or even something else, how may it move the bar or not across these indicators? And really key also to the task force's work was to not just think about what are the indicators, but for whom are we most interested? And what they sort of came up with was that we really want to be leading with race and leading with making sure that as we're evaluating the benefits or the potential additional burdens of any particular policy across different indicators, that we're making sure that we're looking to have benefits to go to a Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as low-income communities, people with disabilities, multilingual communities, and displaced communities. And so those were that's the sort of the whom are we trying to look at and across sort of what indicators and outcomes. So this framework really became the backbone for a lot of our sort of discussions and evaluation work across the different pricing strategies as they move through the 18-month process. And just one last thing on that is we're hoping as a bureau that this is actually a tool that can be used not just in this pricing conversation, but in other policy evaluation conversations. So the 5 types of pricing, again, Emma sort of showed some pictures of things like cordons, and I think that when we say the word congestion pricing, that's what a lot of people think about, or tolling, and the tolling conversation ODOT is having. But we really looked at 5 different types of pricing that could be used, and we think sort of the indicator evaluation and some of the things we want to see can apply across all of these types of pricing. So the first one is prices on parking, and as we all know, there's already parking pricing, but we were still looking at could you use it and make it more dynamic, or use it sort of really to advance the outcomes that we want to see even more than we have right now. We also had a conversation about using pricing more intentionally for prices on vehicle-based commercial services, sometimes known as private for hire trips, also more commonly known as things like Uber and Lyft, as well as prices on different forms of urban delivery, which again, we know that the trips associated with urban delivery are going up, and especially over the pandemic have gone up, I think, even more. We did talk about highway tolling as a form of, depending on how you design it, could be a form of congestion pricing. We talked about the potential for a cordon, drawing a circle essentially around an area and charging people more to either enter or to go around in an area. And then we also talked about the potential for a charge called a road usage, or sometimes a per mile charge. And this is something where it's actually being discussed a lot also in transportation revenue conversations, where as we move likely in the future away from a gas tax, system for paying for our transportation system, people will be more likely to sort of pay a fee based on the amount of miles that they're traveling. And so as we make that transition, there's also the potential to not just pay per mile, but maybe we pay per mile and pay based on congested areas or things like that. So we talked about the potential for that to be a pricing tool in the future as well. And those, you'll notice across those areas, some of them parking pricing, potentially some things around urban delivery even are things that the city of Portland really, we set our own parking policies and we are able to make decisions in that realm ourselves. Highway tolling, a future with a road usage charge, those are things that the city isn't really going to do ourselves. Right now, we actually know that ODOT, the Oregon Department of Transportation, is leading their own conversation around tolling, and they're actually lead in thinking about how a per mile charge would go as well. So some of these are things we could do. Some would require state and regional, potentially even federal coordination. And this is a chart that sort of shows that continuum of, which are the ones that we have control over and which are the ones that require more coordination across the horizontal axis, and then, the vertical axis, I haven't been in school a while, I forgot my axes. And then in addition, this is also looked as sort of showing the differences across these ideas and how technologically complex they are. Again, there are things that we could do with changing parking pricing right now, and then there are some things that would really require a whole different level of technology if we wanted to have a parking pricing system that changed, by the hour or by the day and was really dynamic based on the situation. So we looked at a variety of tools. Some of them are pretty easy. We could do ourselves. We could do with existing technology, and some of them really require a lot of coordination and probably technology that is not on the ground yet. So all of that was, Emma shared the why we're doing this, a little bit about what we're doing. And so what did the task force come up with? At the end of the 18 months, the last couple of meetings, they discussed and deliberated over some final recommendations that they then were presented to City Council, City of Portland leadership at City Council. And one of the things before getting into the specifics of the recommendations is we had 19 folks on this task force, and as I said, they all came in with different sort of backgrounds and different ideas and thoughts about pricing at the beginning. And they learned a lot from presentations. They learned a lot from each other. We learned a lot from them over the course of the 18 months. And one of the things that we were, in many ways sort of blown away at is by the end, when we had the final votes on the recommendations, there were of the 19 people, one was absent at the final meeting. So there were 18 people who were in attendance at that last meeting. And each of the recommendations, we voted on them separately, but each of the recommendations had at least 16 people in support. So it's, we didn't put this together and have, just barely sort of majority or anything. This was a group of recommendations that was really pretty fully, not 100%, but pretty fully supported by the whole group. And something we feel was good about the process and helps us know that this is hopefully on the right track. So what did they come up with? The first thing is something called the Principles for Pricing for Equitable Mobility. And really the most, I think, important statement in many ways is that they did say their recommendation was pricing holds promise. It holds promise for advancing equitable mobility, creating a safer, more climate-friendly, more equitable system. But it was definitely a qualified, but only if designed, implemented, and adjusted with intention. And then they had some specific recommendations for us that the city really should urgently move forward and advance pricing options for equitable mobility policies. And we heard a theme around urgency a lot from the task force, as well as when we presented this to City Council, knowing especially that the status quo has so many problems that we heard this, we need to do things differently. Please move forward urgently and start to make some changes. They also recommended to us that we use the equitable mobility framework to guide our decision making and analyze what we're going to do. as much as they said to move forward urgently and do some of these things, they also said you can't do it alone. We know that pricing is just one tool, and it really needs to be done in complement with a number of other strategies. Again, if we're going to make it harder and more expensive for people to drive, we need to be very intentionally, simultaneously making it easier for people to take other modes. And then again, despite saying move forward urgently, they also said we need to continue to talk to other folks and do deeper community engagement, and to design according to some equitable mobility guidelines, which are on the next slide. So some of the design guidelines are that when we're actually setting policy and choosing to, or figuring out how to really create a new price signal, to really prioritize reducing miles driven, and again, centering the climate and equity outcomes. And this is sort of speaks to the question of pricing as a revenue tool and a policy tool, and that there's sort of a delicate balance of, if you just are charging more to raise money, you're going to get a different outcome than if you're charging more to advance these policy goals. And so the recommendation was to really try to prioritize advancing the policy goals. We also heard very clearly from the task force around the importance of providing exemptions for households living on low incomes. One of the key things, again, as we're charging more, is to make sure that we're not further burdening those who have been burdened so far. And along those lines, to make sure that we're also reducing unequal burdens related to any new technology, as well as related to potential enforcement of new pricing strategies. And then the final one, even though they want us to sort of prioritize designing for policy outcomes, not prioritizing for revenue. Again, we know pricing raises revenue, and then the importance of using that revenue to really reinvest into further strategies that help to create, again, a more equitable system with more options. So then we actually have a pretty robust report and a detailed set of recommendations, and I'm going to summarize sort of a lot of things pretty quickly here. But the recommendations were broken down into some things that they thought we could move forward really, hopefully pretty quickly on, nearer term pricing strategies, some longer term pricing strategies that they want us to keep thinking about, but no, they're not going to happen this year probably. And then some recommendations around the complementary strategies that they really thought would be key. In the nearer term pricing strategies recommendations, the first one actually is not so much a price signal that is raised, but there was a recommendation for us to work with employers to offer more incentives, essentially. If for employers, for instance, that currently offer free parking, to also say that you should be offering transit strategies or other multimodal strategies, and don't just give your employees free parking, offer other similar commuter benefits out to employees. The second one was a recommendation to work on some pricing strategies related either to transportation network companies, like Uber and Lyft, or to urban delivery fees, again, knowing that those are sort of growing segments of trips in the city that we want to try to send the right price signals in those areas. They also recommended that we do move forward with some additional parking strategies, both in public parking areas as well as even in some private parking areas. And then finally, as I mentioned, ODOT is working right now on developing a program for tolling on I-5 and I-205, and they really recommended that we continue as a city to advocate with ODOT and essentially advocate for similar design principles as ODOT rolls out their tolling program. Then in the longer term pricing strategies, there was a lot of interest from the task force and recommendation to really try to move towards that future where the parking system could be really truly dynamic based on demand, based on what's happening on the streets. The task force also had a lot of interest in the idea of a vehicle miles traveled fee. The modeling that we showed them showed that this really has a lot of potential for changing behavior and creating more of the system we want to see. And so they recommended we continue to think about that in the future. And then finally, there was a recommendation to continue thinking about the potential for something like a central city cordon This one, the modeling showed a few more sort of questions about what sort of diversion would happen outside of the central city. And so this one, I think the recommendation was a little bit more cautious of, yes, continue to evaluate, but we need more information to see if it is really a tool that could work here. Or is there something like a vehicle miles traveled fee that could accomplish the same thing? And then again, just so that there was, a theme we heard over and over was the importance of these complementary strategies, continuing to invest in transit, in bike and ped infrastructure and programs and safety improvements, in giving people out those incentives and financial support. Also, some conversation about the importance of electric vehicle transition, and specifically in advancing our climate goals. And then, of course, the interconnectedness of all of this with our affordable housing and land use policies. And then just sort of quickly, the task force also had some recommendations to us and to City Hall around how we should be implementing these things, and really heard from them that the city should be taking a leadership role. So many of these conversations are interconnected, state and regional conversations, but they want to see the city leading. The importance of regular data collection and surveying. We know as we want to evaluate the particular benefits and burdens of different policies, we know we need to get better data, something we're working on. They also, of course, we are doing this during COVID-19, and the task force did say, like, move forward, don't wait too long and see what happens, but we do need to continue to understand how our transportation system is being influenced right now, and make sure that we're not completely out of sync with what's happening because of the pandemic. And then again, we continued to hear the need for additional community engagement and coalition building, and as well as something else that was an ongoing theme was exploring models for a unified financial assistance system. We really heard about the importance of don't create a system where people have to apply for a new low-income program, for a new parking program, and a different one for a VMT program, and a different one for ODOT for tolling and things like that. Just to, as much as possible, how can we create programs that help to meet the needs of people living on low incomes without burdening them, and really providing as many benefits as possible. And so all of this was brought to City Council about a month and a half ago on October 13th. And at City Council, we shared all of this, we shared more detail, and then we heard back from City Council. We were directed to take these recommendations, which are both very robust, but also pretty high level, and take them, and as staff, really develop them into more specific policy proposals, especially around those near-term areas, but really all of it. How can we take what we heard and say, okay, here are some actual specific things we can do. And during that time, again, we know we need to do more data collection and more research. We need to do more stakeholder outreach. And we need to continue to think about how can we advance strategies that really do both advance policy goals and also sort of grapple with the revenue, especially as Emma said, there was a slide. We are sort of separately having revenue challenges, which have gotten really more intense over the pandemic. So we have to think about the revenue piece with these new strategies. And again, to the urgency, we were told, don't go back and think for another 2 years. Try to do this next phase pretty quickly and return to council within 9 months, is what we were told. We're already down to close to 7 months, so we have some work to do. And then I think we wanted to end with just a couple of quick lessons learned that, when we're doing this, as Emma said, we did this differently than a lot of other cities, which have dove in really at the technical level first. But we, especially talking to our colleagues in some other cities, we feel like this has been a really useful, important step to lead with this community conversation about what are the values, what are the priority outcomes that people want to see as we talk about this really hard topic. Nobody wants to pay more. So we need to do it thoughtfully, and we need to start with what community members think. And so they were able to raise all sorts of critical issues, and we think that is now going to help us set up a more efficient and effective sort of technical next step. Again, just important to share that we really did hear sort of checking in with folks, we sort of got confirmation that they think that pricing holds promise as a tool for advancing equitable mobility. but again, only if designing it really carefully and intentionally. We also continued to hear that it's just one tool in the toolbox. Don't move on, don't take this and say, okay, great, we're gonna do all these pricing things and forget everything else. We need to continue to work on the complementary strategies. And then a really important piece, I think, is that one of the reasons that folks think it can make a difference is because of the challenges of the status quo. So when we're looking at how different pricing strategies can help impact outcomes, we have to continually be sharing those or be evaluating those against the outcomes right now and the outcomes in the future if we don't make the kinds of pricing changes we're talking about. So it's not, just comparing charging more with a perfect status quo, it's comparing charging more with a status quo that has a lot of challenges. And I think that is, that's all we have for today.
All right, thank you, Shoshana and Emma. And before we jump into the Q&A, we'd like to share a short survey that will be popping up on your Zoom session about the possibility of holding the seminar in person in the spring. So the link is going to be, well, it's popping up right now. So please do that poll right now, and we'll jump into the Q&A right now with kind of a contextual question from the audience. They were wondering, how does Portland's transportation emissions factor as a percentage of total emissions compared to other cities?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I had some good time too to kind of look up a few stats as Shoshana was speaking, but it's a great question. So as I mentioned, in our region, it's the biggest piece of the pie. It's about 43% of emissions. It's also the piece of the pie that unfortunately is increasing, whereas several other sectors we're seeing declines. When you look at the national scale, we're higher than the US as a whole. The US as a whole, transportation is about 29% of emissions, still a big wedge, but a little bit smaller than here. And then I looked at a few other kind of comparable cities in Seattle, I believe, according to their website. So hope SDOT's up to date, but I think I saw that it was 60% of emissions in Seattle and about 45% in San Francisco. So I think the kind of punchline there is transportation is a big contributor in a lot of places, and even bigger contributor in urban areas. But it's, that here it is definitely that biggest wedge of the pie, and so one that we at PBOT feel a lot of responsibility about addressing.
Great. Just a reminder to post your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom panel, so we can ask the questions of the speakers. So a question about, while there's been a lot of consideration about pricing, how much consideration about how you use the funds generated from the pricing? Will they be used, for example, to fund low-income transit or bike share travel programs?
Sure, I can answer that. Yes, definitely. There was one of the key recommendations from the task force was around the importance of using those funds to, and we had there were a lot of things they'd like to see the funds for. Transit came out on top. I think we took different surveys along the way and using them to support transit, whether it's transit service or direct transit incentives or building more transit facilities. All of those things were seen as important, as were things like more multimodal facilities, things like bike share. Sort of all of that came up again as a very clear recurring theme that if you're going to charge more and make it harder to drive, we need to make the other multimodal facilities as easy as possible. So that was as easy and accessible as possible. That was a clear recommendation. I think now, as we again take the ideas into more specific policies, that's what we have to do, is sort of figure out how can we best design a new parking program and use those funds to sort of advance goals like providing more access to transit for low-income users and things like that. So definitely part of the consideration right now, and a clear recommendation from the task force.
Thank you. So a follow-up question about whether you received any pushback or animosity about who was involved in the process at various stages. How did you define the stakeholders and whether the meetings were public? Just kind of talking a little bit more about the process.
Yeah, maybe I can start, Shoshana, and you can chime in with what I miss. It's a great question, and as we said from the outset, we knew this is a controversial topic, and so we were not, at all looking for a group of people who were already on board. We really wanted to have a really honest, transparent, and open conversation. And so, as Shoshana said, when we did the recruitment, we got one of the largest responses to a city recruitment. I think at that time it was like 130 people sent in applications. And a lot of times when agencies set up these kinds of committees or groups, they'll sort of be like 2 seats for a business interest, 2 seats for a freight interest, 2 seats for an environmental interest. And we intentionally didn't do that. There's some city policy about having people serve in an individual capacity, but we also wanted to make sure that we were getting a range of perspectives, and our recruitment kind of listed out a huge laundry list of like 20 things, a lot of those that I just mentioned: business, freight, environment, transit, bike, ped, you name it, but not kind of organizational seats to really get people who had different professional experience, lived experience, and different perspective they wanted to bring to the table. So we went through all 130, kind of made sure we had all those kind of 20 different perspectives kind of represented. But I will say that because we didn't do the kind of like slot for everything, and there was a little bit of attrition, I think we started with about 24 and ended with 19. We wouldn't say that those 19 represent every single interest in the city of Portland or in the region. And that, I think, is why that kind of further community engagement was a strong recommendation out of the task force. And we'll also admit, this was an intentional decision to do a deep dive, 18-month kind of graduate level conversation with a small and diverse, but a small group of people. And we recognize that that's one type of stakeholder engagement that is different than doing kind of a broad outreach strategy. So when we think of the future, that is definitely something to think about. But I think we definitely heard from council when we set this up, prioritize equity. And so, as Shoshana said, everyone at that table, whether they liked pricing, didn't like pricing, didn't know, they had to say they were there to have a conversation about whether pricing could advance equity and equitable outcomes. And all meetings were public. All the ones on Zoom were recorded, and I put the link to our website in the chat. You can find all of our meeting minutes and recordings from the Zoom ones on there.
Okay, I have a question that's not in the Q&A panel, but and it's interesting to think of sort of on my own research that sort of some of it was observational pre-pandemic and how things have changed. So how much did the group get to talk about, you started pre-pandemic where we've got this set of travel patterns, work AM, PM peaks, and now things are different. Did you get a chance to sort of think about that or discuss what that might impact on the pricing strategies?
I can start here. So we talked about that some. I wouldn't say we went super deep on that with the task force, but it definitely sort of was a recurring theme watching some of the changes. And it is certainly something that we have to think about now as we're getting specific in thinking about ideas. One of the things, of course, that is changing also is the travel patterns to downtown. And so, that means we're probably farther away from a cordon even than maybe we would have thought when we started. I think we're now in this phase, as we do more technical analysis, there's information we have. We also still, some of it is more anecdotal. We don't have really great information fully yet about the changing travel patterns. I think one of the recommendations that did come out of the task force was around parking and expanding more parking areas out into the neighborhoods. And I think that's one of the things that we talked about again, as things are shifting maybe from, everyone driving downtown all the time to more neighborhood business district level traffic, which you already see a lot of, but if that's going to continue, just the importance of having strategies that meet those changing needs. And I think the other one, the VMT fee, we also talked about that again as a more fluid sort of policy tool that, you know, we can use regardless of when or where you're driving. So it's not a super like hard, clear answer there, but it came up and it will definitely continue to come up. And I think we're just going to have to have to see how things go. And in many of the short-term strategies, I think we can make some moves and then see if they're, if they make sense with the pandemic and then adjust. And actually that's one more thing that we heard a lot was the importance of sort of piloting, which I think is true both because of the, we're trying to do hard things and because things are changing right now. So maybe we test something, we test it for a year, we evaluate, we see if things have changed again, and then we make adjustments.
And the only thing I'd add on that is, and it kind of goes back to our very first slide of like how you define pricing. We picked our long acronym pricing options for equitable mobility for a variety of reasons, but I do think, several cities that were really having congestion pricing conversations, then the pandemic hit, congestion sort of went away, and it was like, is this still relevant? We asked our task force pretty bluntly, in March, first or in April 2020, like first, do you still have capacity to do this given everything in the world, but also does it still feel relevant? And I think that focus more on a broad definition of equitable mobility, and it's not just about congestion, it's those costs that even if the roads are flowing freely, we still have the emissions, we still have the health impacts, we still have the economic impacts. They said, no, it's still relevant. We still have to evaluate and we can't look in the crystal ball and totally predict the future, but it doesn't mean that the question is no longer important.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about one of your near-term recommendations on TNC and urban delivery fees? Has this been done anywhere else?
Sure, I'll start. So, well, first of all, the city of Portland has a fee on TNC fees already. We have just a 50 cents sort of across the board fee. It's really just a sort of an administrative and operations fee. There are a number of states that are not able even to do that level of regulation. They're preempted way. And so far, Portland is not. There are a few places that have done more dynamic or more sort of targeted fees. Chicago is one good example. They instituted a fee. I think they just put it in place around January 2020. So they also, I think, haven't shown a ton of results because they did it for a few months and then things changed. But they have a fee that is it's more downtown, less out in the neighborhoods. I think I'm being told my internet is unstable. Can you hear me?
You're good. You're good.
Okay. And it is more targeted to send those signals. And there's a couple of other places exploring those things too. I think on the urban delivery side, there are a lot of cities, I think, that are watching the rise of urban delivery and thinking about what they can do. And yet there's not, it's a tough environment. And there's not a lot of examples yet of people really adding new price signals on, because there's federal regulations we have to consider. There's just all sorts of dynamics there. So while we know it's a growing share of VMT, I think we're all trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that sends the right signals, also acknowledges. And one of the other things we heard in the task force is the trips are growing because people are wanting things and are wanting things delivered. So again, this sort of balance of trying to capture more of the costs of those growing trips while acknowledging that they're serving a purpose. And certainly over the pandemic, trips grew because of health concerns. So trying to move forward thoughtfully in that way. But there's not a ton of examples. So we're talking to some other cities who have similar thoughts, but we'll be doing it together.
I think we can squeeze in one last question here. What are the plans for the community engagement piece, given there'll be this large break from the start of the conversation with the community towards the final policy. So what's the plan sort of for engagement during the technical analysis piece?
I can maybe start on that one, and Shoshana might have more to add. I think, to be really honest, it's kind of still a little early days. You know, we were just at council and got that direction to move forward. So what we're doing now is we're taking those individual recommendations, those individual ideas, and thinking about what next steps look like. You know, what next steps look like in terms of the policy analysis and the technical work we would need to do, but also what that kind of engagement strategy will be. I think what was really helpful from starting with the task force process, and what we'll do is we'll continue those principles throughout, the principles of, you know, centering climate and equity outcomes. So as we probably do enter a new phase of outreach, that's going to have to be broader. I think we also feel really anchored still in those values and those equitable mobility framework areas in terms of the things that we want to analyze on both the technical side, but also have kind of community conversations around. And I just want to say, you know, the 19 folks that worked with us throughout this process, we cannot say more positive things about them. They are just the greatest group. And I think kind of in our minds also represent, to the degree they want to be, but, you know, great ambassadors, you know, that we can continue to work with and call on as kind of thought partners and also community members. And so, you know, we're still kind of sketching out what that future engagement strategy looks like, but we want to build on that conversation we had and not make it feel like it's a break or a start of a whole new conversation, because we don't really have the time to waste, right? We need to be moving.
All right, thank you so much, Shoshana and Emma. And that concludes our fall series of the Friday Transportation Seminar. So students, please remember to turn in your weekly reflections and final reflection by next Wednesday. Thank you so much all for joining us this term, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.